Well, hello everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Will Beharrell. I'm the librarian here at the Linnean Society. And today I'm going to be examining one of my favourite items from our collection of printed books, namely a copy of James Edward Smith's Flora Britannica, richly illustrated by the Reverend Richard Dreyer. Before we get started, I'll just say in passing that it's a real privilege to be able to host this. This is the 10th installment in our Linnean Lens series. It seems hardly credible to me that we can have done 10 of these talks already. We started back in August of last year with my colleague Isabelle Chamontier, who is on the call, discussing one of Carl Linnaeus's student manuscripts. And since then, we've had a pretty varied menu. We've had a medieval incunable, Anna Atkins's cyanotype photography, and most recently Charles Darwin's trusty vasculum, or botanizing box, with contributors from the UK and Belgium. We're really proud of the series and very grateful to everyone who has supported it. And the whole lot, I think, is available to view on our YouTube channel. So please do take a look if you haven't seen them already. For those who haven't come to a Linnean Lens event before, I should explain the talk is usually split into three rough sections. We'll start with a little introduction to the item and its context with an inevitable PowerPoint presentation. And I'll try to keep that bit relatively short, around sort of 5 to 10 minutes. And then we'll move on to the main event, which is an on-camera examination of Richard Dreyer's beautiful books. And then if I've been disciplined and kept to time, we should have an opportunity for a few questions. And please do feel free to post these as we go along. If you could post them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your window, rather than the chat, that will help us to pass the questions at the end of the session. I plan to speak for about 20 minutes, and then I'm hoping that the rest of the half hour, 45 minutes can be given over to questions. And so I shall start sharing my screen. Can you see my PowerPoint presentation? Good. So the history of this item is really the story of three people. James Edward Smith, the founder of the Linnean Society and the author of Flora Britannica. The Reverend Richard Dreyer, who bought a copy and improved it so lavishly, and Eliza Dreyer, Richard's widow. Now, the eagle-eyed among you will have noticed that only two of these images are proper portraits. There's no portrait of Richard Dreyer, to my knowledge, so I've subbed in William Collins from Pride and Prejudice, published in Dreyer's lifetime in 1813. It's almost certainly not a very flattering comparison from Dreyer's point of view, but it's rather how I see all Victorian or Georgian clergymen, rather, in my imagination, so I hope you'll indulge me. And lastly, Eliza, Dreyer's wife, who inherited his estate, including his collection of books and papers. Her likeness is also lost, very sadly, so far as I can make out, but this rather lovely memorial of her survives in a set of almshouses that she endowed in her hometown of Bungay in Suffolk. James Edward Smith is probably the best known of our main characters, and I shan't run through all his many achievements here. Suffice to say, Smith founded the Linnean Society in 1788, having purchased the Linnean collections from Carl Linnaeus's widow in 1784. He was probably best known in his lifetime as a botanist and as a writer of multi-volume floras of Great Britain, often working in collaboration with James Sowerby, the noted naturalist and scientific illustrator. And the book we'll see in a moment is of that type, a 2-volume flora published between 1800 and 1804, and providing a handy, if not very colourful, inventory of the plants of Great Britain, complete with scholarly cross-references. Like many small format botanical books of the time, it has no illustrations. And as you can see, its appearance on the page is very plain and businesslike. It's not a particularly rare book. You can pick out copies secondhand for a few £100. And to the non-specialist, it can risk looking rather dull. But at this point enters the Reverend Richard Dreyer, who transforms these rather dowdy volumes into a luminous and intricate artifact. And as you can see, the transformation is really quite pronounced. Miraculous was the word I used in my title. And we'll see a little bit more evidence of that up close in just a moment. But a brief word about Dreyer first, who is not well remembered today. Dreyer took his first degree from Trinity Hall, Cambridge in 1785, and after a spell in Buckinghamshire, moved to take up a living in Bungay in 1799, staying there for the rest of his life. He was a passionate amateur botanist and served as a chaplain to Richard, Viscount Fitzwilliam, whose collections formed the foundation of the eponymous Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge. Dreyer became a fellow of the Linnean Society in 1817, part of our first generation, if you like, sponsored by a host of respected botanists and entomologists, and enjoyed a lively correspondence with a coterie of botanists, clergy, and men of letters all over the country, whose names he scrupulously records. Like many Georgian clergymen, his job was not especially demanding, and financial security, married to abundant free time, left him with ample opportunity to pursue his own passion projects. And I think with that, we will turn to the flora itself. So I'll stop sharing my screen. And can you see a book on a book cushion? Very good. I hope that image is relatively clear for everyone at home. So why were these paintings made and how were they done? Well, we know they were produced by Richard Dreyer himself, because in his will of 1818, he specifically itemizes the flora and states that it is illustrated with drawings of my own. As you can see, the artwork is precise, confident, bold in its use of color, and quite remarkably proficient. There's almost no evidence of pencil drafting, second attempts, or the erasing or concealing of mistakes. And the images give every indication of having been set down on the page in a fair copy at the first attempt. And this gives us actually the first clue as to Dreyer's working method, which clearly involved a heavy reliance on published images rather than drawing from life. There is some evidence that Dreyer took his book into the field, and if you look at the top left-hand margin of this page, just above the heading Exandria, you might just be able to make out an annotation by Dreyer in which he says that the Galanthus was found by our man Esquire, with whom I went, and he names a couple of villages in the date February 14th, 1821. So he does appear to have at least made some observations in the field. But by and large, Dreyer seems to have drawn upon a catalogue of pre-published botanical images when putting this artwork together. And chief among these was the work of James Sowerby, James Edward Smith's great collaborator, who I mentioned a bit earlier, and in particular a monumental work called English Botany, which I'm sure many people will be aware of, published in 36 volumes between 1790 and 1814. And if you bear with me for just a moment, I should be able to show you an example of an illustration of Dreyer's transposed, if you like, from Sowerby's Botany. So I shall just move Dreyer out of the way for the time being. This is volume 1 of the first edition of English Botany, This is the Linnean Society's copy. Move my little book slip out of the way. I hope that's reasonably visible. So here you see Galanthus nivalis, the snowdrop. This is a very famous illustration of Sowerby's. And then by point of comparison, we had the Dreyer illustration in volume 1 of the Flora Britannica. It's a pity I can't place these side by side. Unfortunately, the camera has a fairly limited frame of reference, so I can't put two books on screen simultaneously. But I hope you can appreciate that that snowdrop is a copy of the one from Sowerby. Some might say that a reliance on pre-existing images rather diminishes Dreyer's achievement, but I think this rather ignores the copyist's skill and considerable ingenuity. As you saw in the original Sowerby, the botanical illustrations are depicted in discrete plates. They're quite considerably larger than the available space in the margins of Flora Britannica. And so to fit this image into a confined space of a margin while preserving its detail and its composition and all in correct proportion is no mean feat. And indeed, there are examples of Dreyer having to become a little creative in his transpositions. So rotating flowers from their original orientation, and that's what's happened here with the snowdrop, placing them in mirror image, and even judiciously trimming outer leaves and petals. And I can turn to a further page. By way of example, this is one of my favorites. This is the snake's head fritillary, which I know is a plant that many people love. I hope that can be seen on the viewer. Dreyer's reproductions are so precise that some have speculated that he actually made use of a mechanical aid. And when I was preparing for this talk, I came across an article by a former volunteer at the Linnean Society called Enid Slatter, sadly no longer with us, who wrote about Dreyer's illustrated books in the early 2000s. I'm indebted to Enid's article in all sorts of ways, but one of her most eye-catching suggestions was that Dreyer might have used a device known as a camera lucida to create these illustrations. The camera lucida was invented in 1806 by a chemist called William Wollaston, so about the right time for Dreyer. And it uses a mounted and angled prism to cast a superimposed image of the subject onto a drawing surface, which the artist can then trace or copy. It would certainly explain Dreyer's precision, but I do have my doubts. The camera would have been a reasonably expensive item, and no such equipment is listed in Dreyer's fairly detailed will. And I wonder whether it would have allowed for the sort of elaborate changes of composition and arrangement that Dreyer uses to fit his images into the confined marginal spaces of the Flora Britannica. But the camera remained a common tool among microscopists, especially well into the 20th century. So it's not beyond the bounds of possibility. And it's certainly an interesting theory. We've speculated a little on how these beautiful books were illustrated, but not really touched on why they were made and enhanced in this elaborate way. We've discussed how Dreyer's fairly cushy posting in Bungay left him with ample free time, but even with that in mind, there are hundreds of hours of labor here. So why the effort? Well, Dreyer wasn't the only person to illustrate the margins of botanical books. And in fact, it seems to have been a relatively commonplace practice to make brief notes and sketches in the white space around scientific texts, either as part of the process of fieldwork, which Dreyer attempts in part, or as part of, as an artistic pastime, which I think is probably closer to Dreyer's motivation. But as I've spent more time with these items, I've come to wonder whether there might be another subconscious motivation. And as I've spent more and more time with these volumes, I've been reminded ever more strongly of another type of marginal illustration incorporating botanical elements, which I feel sure Dreyer would have known, and namely religious manuscript illumination. And with that, I will briefly return to my PowerPoint. Forgive me while I scroll back to my place. Now, I have to be a little bit careful here. Manuscript illumination in medieval and Renaissance religious texts like this gorgeous 16th century lectionary at Magdalen College serves a very different purpose to Dreyer's marginal illustrations. It has a very different relationship with its parent text. I think Dreyer would be scandalized by the idea of the Flora Britannica as a sacred text in need of exegesis. And it lacks the dense symbolism of patronage that is characteristic of so many illuminated prayer books. And you can see in this lectionary, this was a commission of Cardinal Wolsey's, and you can see his iconography in the borders around the edges. But in its close attention to proportion and composition, its scrupulous care with the parent text, and its almost pathologically perfect execution, I think the comparison with Dreyer, a priest, and this sort of manuscript illumination is a little bit too tempting to discard, particularly in a man who we'll see shortly was possessed of quite strident religious convictions. Given these images were largely created indoors rather than in the field, and smell of the lamp, to borrow a phrase, I'm very tempted to see their creation as a private and as a devotional act, as much as a beguiling hobby or a product of field work. Which brings me finally to the story of how these volumes arrived in our library, a transfer of ownership which very nearly didn't happen at all. Dreyer makes his last will and testament in July 1818, nearly a year after becoming a fellow of the Society, and leaves to what was then the Royal Linnean Society his illustrated flora and his botanical papers and artworks. However, in a codicil of 1824, some 6 years later, he revokes the gift for reasons that have been a cause of much discussion. And chief among the explanations is Dreyer's recorded dislike of dissenters or nonconformists. And in his will, he states very clearly that his funeral shall not be served either directly or indirectly by any person who shall be a dissenter from the Church of England. And this presents a particular difficulty for the Linnean Society, as our founder, James Edward Smith, was himself a nonconformist. He was a Unitarian. And in 1818, he was controversially barred from taking up a chair at Cambridge University on account of his faith. And the snub became something of a cause célèbre at the time, and the scientific and scholarly community rather divided along conservative and progressive lines, either defending the status quo or protesting Smith's rejection by the university. And Enid Slatter and others have speculated that the withdrawal of the gift by Dreyer might have been evidence of him picking a side in this rather bitter social debate of the age. Happily for us, Dreyer's wife, Eliza, the third character in our drama, was not so inflexible. Her husband predeceased her, and so at his passing in 1838, she clearly attempts a kind of rapprochement with the Society and presents these beautiful books to the library, where they have resided ever since. As a monument, really, to their owner's devotion and his dedication. And that is really the end of my little presentation, so I shall stop sharing my screen. I hope I haven't overrun too badly. Thank you very much for listening.
Will, thank you so much. That was brilliant. I'm just wondering if you want to show a little bit more of the book, maybe leaf through it just a bit, just to
Yes.
get just to give people the
Yes, of course. What I was hoping was that I would get my waffle out of the way fairly quickly, and then we could spend the rest of the time going through the book, and maybe, Isabel, you could read out any questions that people have.
Sure. There's a few questions that are coming in. Do you want to leaf through first?
Yeah, sure.
Just a couple of pages.
I'm going to disappear out of frame because I need to stand to turn the pages, really. So this was the fritillary. And then the organizing principle behind my little book slips is simply things that I thought were attractive. So this page in particular, we're still in the Hexandria, it's very beautiful. But you can see the care he takes with the text and with the illustrations. He really tries to avoid obscuring the printed text, not least because he's also adding annotations of his own. So some of these are cross-references to other books, but also little fieldwork notes. He lists the names of villages where this plant has been spotted, often with dates and with the people he was with. And I think if we turn to that page, perhaps you can just see on the left there some more fieldwork notes. Whitwell and Shelford in Cambridgeshire, Shipmeadow, these names don't mean anything to me, unfortunately. Glemham, Low Meadows, near the post house in Bury in Suffolk. He often makes quite hyperlocal observations. He'll talk about the flowers growing near a footbridge or near a post house or some other local landmark. So they have some evidential value, really, as historic fieldwork notes.
Actually, a question has just come in, and I will come back to the others. But while you're leafing through, can you point out a more spontaneous painting, perhaps coming from direct observation?
I don't know that spontaneous is the word I would use for Dreyer. It's very considered, it's very carefully done. I think we have some illustrations which are apparently incomplete. So this is volume 2. And can you see Syngenensia? We've got 2 finished illustrations, but can you see in the bottom left here something that has been sketched out in ink by the looks of it, but not yet watercolored? Is that visible there?
Yeah, maybe bring it just a tiny bit up, the volume. No, I mean towards the top. Yeah. Yeah, that's it.
All right, beg your pardon.
Sorry, Will.
They don't teach you this at library school. There you are. But my feeling is that he didn't perhaps take this book physically into the field. I suspect that this is the product of later writing up. That's my feeling. The combination of a reliance on published images and just the general neatness and good order of the text suggests to me that this wasn't something that was knocking around in a bag or being taken regularly out into the field.
Yeah, actually, there's a comment from Robin Walls who says, just a comment, I and other botanists commonly make identification notes and illustrations of detail not found in the standard floras, obviously a practice that has long pedigree.
I love this one. This is sow thistles. This is a sort of dandelion type plant. This is one absolutely beautiful. And here he has let himself go a little bit. He does impinge on the text a little, but he's clearly drawing with an eye to the scientific value of the illustrations. You do also have sort of carpological illustrations, images of the seeds, the root forms, and the different parts of the plant. It's not just an aesthetic set of criteria he's using. And you can see another one there. But it's the profusion of illustrations that is so striking. Almost every page, every other page has been added to and enhanced with his own drawings. It's a really wonderful thing. I've always been curious to know what happened to his botanical papers, because obviously the floras came to us from Eliza, but as far as I'm aware, no hide nor hair of any other archival material from Richard Dreyer.
No, I don't think we have anything much.
I think.
While you've got the book there, Will, Anke Timmerman, hello Anke, says, I would like to know more about the binding, so I thought maybe you could show it. Present day, and if different, original. Does it match the beautiful marginal drawings?
The binding is a bit of a crime, really. It's this is 1930s buckram. I'm sorry, let me get the book cushion out of the way. You might be able to see it a bit better. A lot of Linnean Society material was bound in this way between about 1920 and about 1960, I would say, a great age for the discarding of Georgian and Victorian bindings, unfortunately. So this is a very commonplace library binding. I don't know anything about how it might have been bound originally, presumably a standard calf, perhaps a little bit like the Sowerby, which you can see is bound in full calf and with gilt spine lettering, but otherwise very plain and workmanlike. I suppose what it does suggest is that the original binding was in poor condition, which might suggest heavy use. Certainly one side effect of adding illustrations like these to a book is that you have to keep it open at a certain place for long periods of time. You're presumably putting stress on the sewing supports. It's pure speculation on my part, really. I had wondered whether it might have been trimmed. The illustrations go right to the edge, as you can see. I think you can probably just make out. I wondered whether the edges of the pages might have been trimmed at some point to fit a binding, but you've got evidence of what looks like a deckled edge on the foredge here, which suggests that maybe this is the original state. But yes, it's a pity it's not in a contemporary binding, but there it is.
Anna-Marie Roos says, are there any press specimens in the volumes?
No, there aren't. That would be wonderful if there were. We do have pressed plant specimens in the Linnean Society collections, quite a few in the Linnean library and a few more scattered elsewhere among the rare and early printed books, but no, none here, so far as I can make out, which I suppose makes sense in a way. If you had spent so much time illuminating was the word I used, a prized book, putting a pressed plant in between the pages might lead to sort of staining or discoloration. So, no evidence of that, unfortunately.
So there's still about quite a few questions. Someone asked, what medium? Watercolors, I assume. They have retained their colors very well.
Yes, they're very vibrant. It's pen, I think, and watercolor.
And Daphne Roberts asks, are all the illustrations copied from elsewhere?
Well, I need to give
yeah, sorry.
I need to give a hat tip at this point to a lady called Margaret Town. I wonder if Margaret's on the call.
No, I was looking, but no, she isn't.
Margaret is a volunteer of ours and has produced the most remarkable piece of work, really. She has gone through these volumes and she has provided IDs and also cross-referenced with the published sources. So she has been able to do, as I did with the Sowerby Snowdrop, she's gone and identified where Dreyer might have sourced his images. I'm not sure whether we're in a position to share that work, as strictly speaking, it's Margaret's, but I feel sure that if you were interested and wanted more information, we would be able to help. But yes, Sowerby is the main source, and I think there is, I'm trying to think what his second source was. No, it's gone.
Sorry, Will, I can't
Yeah.
help you. Well, that partly answers another question, which was asking, was Sowerby the only source for his illustration? But the other part of the question is, what percentage of the plants in the flora were illustrated? And do you have any idea how he made his choice?
So as I say, it's the illustration is profuse. There are illustrations on almost every page. I'm not really sure what the organizing principle was. It might well have been access to an existing image. So if there was a plate in Sowerby that Dreyer liked, then he would reproduce it. It might be guided by fieldwork. You know, there is evidence of fieldwork notes in the flora. So it might be a case of him having spotted something whilst out botanizing and then coming back and creating an image of it. But otherwise, I'm not sure. I think that's where his papers might have proven handy. We sort of come to this flora really shorn of its context, which is a pity.
There's quite a few questions related to the paintings, and then there's a question more about liturgical texts, where I'll come back to. So Andy asks, did Dreyer do any other paintings?
I feel sure that he must have done. He was clearly not without talent, but if he did, I've not seen them. I'm not sure of a cache of material about Dreyer elsewhere. So that is an avenue of further investigation, I think.
And Gina Rowe says, interesting read the cross-sectional drawings. Were there existing illustrations of these at the time too?
Yes, so some of Sowerby's illustrations include sort of anatomical cross-sections and closer detail. So yes, I think that would also have come from pre-published sources. That was the unfinished one, wasn't it?
Yeah, there's an interesting comment on the chat as from someone actually saying, nice to see on the Polygena how he has created a 3D effect by having the leaf disappear and reappear behind the text. But
that's really nice. It's beautifully done. He had a good eye, I think, and what makes this book so impressive in person is the interaction between the illustrations and the text. In a way, I always feel that if you were presented with these images just as they are on a plain piece of paper, you would think, oh, those are nice botanical illustrations, but you might not perhaps give them a second thought, really. But it's the interaction with the printed text. I think that there's some sort of alchemy there, which makes it very, very special, I think.
Someone asks, does he make any reference to medicinal uses of plants?
Not to my knowledge, no. Not in the not in his annotations. I don't want to say no for definite, because I've not read all of his annotations. Again, Margaret would be the person to ask, but I don't believe so.
So a few questions left. Presumably the paper in the flora was not the paper of choice for botanical painting.
Well, he was fortunate in many ways in that early 19th century paper was generally of pretty good quality. At that period, you were still mostly using rag paper, a linen-based paper, which was very durable, very hard wearing, and good for all sorts of things, including painting. It's true, it's not the sort of high quality sort of milled paper that you might see in professional botanical drawings. Whatman, I think, is a famous paper maker of the time. But had he been attempting this on, let's say, a late 19th century book or an early 20th century book, when we move to wood pulp paper, then I think he would have had a much harder time. I think the surface would have been much less forgiving. So he was fortunate, really.
And two more, Will, if you
No,
never know, more might come. How would he have obtained evidence of where how would he have obtained evidence of where found apart from his own anecdotal references? I guess that means where to find the plants or the illustrations. I'm not sure.
I mean, direct observation, I think. He's quite detailed in some of his annotations. I wonder if I've kept the fieldwork note. He goes into quite a lot of detail as to where the plant was observed, you know, almost down to the locale. He talks about who he was with, the date, the species that he saw. I'm afraid I've moved my little slip foolishly, but I think it was direct observation, really. But whether he then sort of makes notes of his field work in a commonplace book or some other text and then transposes them into the flora, or by some other method just from memory, perhaps, we don't know.
Ian Tatham asks, very interested in the theory that he might have been influenced by liturgical texts. From what you say about his religious convictions, were they high rather than evangelical, as art seems to have had more of an appeal?
Yes, I'm going out on a limb a bit, really, with my medieval manuscript illumination theory. I hope people will indulge me in that. I just felt that the comparison was a little bit too tempting to pass up. My sense is that Dreyer was a religious conservative. I don't think he really held with the reforms to the universities that came later in the 19th century, or to the religious reforms of his time. Enid Slatter concludes her article with the theory that Dreyer in later life might not have enjoyed the best health, and she speculates, I think largely without evidence, that Dreyer might have developed Parkinson's or some similar condition, and that this led to a hardening of attitudes. I'm not sure quite where she got that speculation from, but it certainly seems to have been the case that he picked his side, really, in the Smithian debate over the botany chair at Cambridge, and it was really only thanks to his wife later that the books came to us at all.
Sorry, I had muted myself. There's a final, another one has just come in. Did he ever make any insect images in association with the plants?
Now, I need to hold up my hands here and apologize. When I was drafting the blurb for this event, in what I can only describe as a mental absence, included the word entomological and botanical illustrations. I cannot account for this. I was clearly working in a hurry. There are no insect illustrations in the book. And if anyone came hoping to see insects, I'm really, really sorry. That was a slip up on my part.
Well, you could imagine that there would be some, actually. Yeah, it's not unconceivable. The final question so far, and please, if anyone has oh, there's another one coming in. Are there any indications of the intersections of humans and plants, often humorous, as in medieval marginalia?
No, there are no depictions of humans, as far as I can make out. As a genre form, you know, the medieval illumination is very, very different to Dreyer's business. It was really just a sort of aesthetic comparison I was making, I guess. And just the image of him working alone, probably over many hours in a sort of a solitary pursuit, putting these beautiful books together. I sort of thought, what's the psychology really of this? Is it just a pastime or a beguiling one? But no, there's no wider sort of comment or satire on human society. It's very straight down the line botanical illustration.
And Susan Hayes asked, did you say that he recorded the names of his correspondents? And if so, where?
Yes, so I believe that is in the Suffolk Record Office, where his will, I think, is also preserved. But that is a reference I would need to dig out again from Enid Slatter's article. I'm very happy to provide that reference later on if you wanted to drop me a line.
Can you, I don't know if you mentioned it, Will, but where was that article published? Do you remember?
It was published in the Linnean,
yeah.
in I think it's volume 16, the year 2000. I can probably fish it out.
So all the articles from the Linnean are on our website, if I'm not mistaken. So
They are.
Maybe you should be able to find it there. I think that's it for questions, unless everyone has anyone has a last one. I can't see anything coming in. Thank you so much, Will. That was Anna Marie says, what a gorgeous book. An entire network of naturalist and locality records memorialized in this book via botanical illustration. Thank you for a great presentation. And Stella Paniatova says, just a comment, the comparison to illuminated manuscript is apt, especially to the naturalistic plant borders in circa 1500 French royal manuscripts. For example, Jean Bourdichon. So there you go.
Thank you. I'm glad I've not gone out on a bad. That's good to know.
And oh, thank you, Lainey. So our special publications manager has just put in the link to the and Padma's retweeted it to the journal article by Enid Slater. Is there a copy of the book available? Donna, if you want to see it, you're going to have to come into the library. We are open from Tuesday to Friday, 10 to 5, and you're very welcome to come in and consult the book there. Just to finish, and thank you again, Will, that was a superb presentation. Just to finish on a couple of things, what Will has talked about is actually mentioned in our book of treasure called L50 Objects, Stories and Discoveries from the Linnean Society. So this is a kind of cornucopia of some of our treasures. It includes Linnean manuscripts, Linnean specimens, but also much, much more from our fellows over the ages. And here we go. We've got Richard Dreyer's page on Dreyer's Flora Britannica, illustrated Flora Britannica. This is available online, and I had it all ready to go. Padma, if you wouldn't mind putting the link, that would be great. And the last thing I wanted to say was that our next Linnean Lens will be on Monday, the 14th of November, and it will focus on a beautiful pen and ink illustration manuscript by Frank Nichols on medicinal plants, which dates to the early 18th century, was entirely destroyed, well, entirely, not entirely, but very, very damaged during the Blitz, and conserved by our conservator Janet Ashdown, who will team up with our archivist Liz McGow to give this presentation. And as Will did, spotlight it on the manuscript itself. So do join us if you're interested. This will be on Monday, the 14th of November, if I've got it right, and it should be shortly on our events page. Thank you so much, Will, again, for such a brilliant presentation. Thank you to all of you who have come today to listen to Will, and we hope to see you soon at a Linnean Society event. Bye bye, everyone.